Write in the comments which country you're watching from, and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. November 17, 1922. The Golden Horn is shrouded in a cold, pre-dawn mist. Inside the gilded cage of Yıldız Palace, a man prepares to become a ghost. He is Mehmed VI, the 36th Ottoman Sultan, Caliph of Islam, shadow of God on earth. But his titles are now just echoes in empty halls. An empire that stood for 6 centuries is breathing its last. In a few hours, a British warship will spirit him away, not as a monarch, but as a refugee. This is the story of that final night, the story of the man who turned the key on an empire. In the gilded twilight of the Ottoman Empire, some princes were born for the throne, and others were born for the cage. For decades, Prince Mehmed Vahideddin was a man of the cage. Not a physical prison of iron bars, but one of opulent irrelevance, a velvet-lined confinement known as the kafes. He was the youngest son of Sultan Abdülmecid I, a footnote in a long line of succession, a ghost haunting the sprawling palaces along the Bosphorus. While his brother, the formidable Sultan Abdülhamid II, navigated the treacherous currents of global politics, Vahideddin lived a life of quiet scholarship and deep, melancholic piety. He was a relic of an older time, a man who preferred the intricate verses of the Quran and the quiet solitude of his library at Çengelköy Palace to the political machinations consuming the capital. He watched the world from a distance, seeing the rise of the Young Turks, the deposition of his own brother, and the slow, inexorable decay of the 600-year-old empire. He was considered frail, unassuming, and politically insignificant, and this perception was his greatest protection. In a dynasty where ambitious princes often met untimely ends, to be forgotten was to survive. He saw his nephews and brothers ahead of him in line, each a barrier between him and a destiny he never sought. His days were a metronome of prayer, study, and contemplation, his world circumscribed by palace walls and the shimmering waters of the strait. He was a man out of time, a scholar prince in an age of revolution and rifles. Power was a distant storm cloud, a tempest that raged over other men's heads. He was safe in the calm eye of the hurricane, a forgotten prince waiting for a death that was not his own, utterly unaware that the storm was turning, and that it was about to break directly over him, washing away the world he knew and thrusting him onto the most perilous throne on earth. The world Vahideddin had so carefully observed from a distance finally came crashing through his palace gates in 1914. The Great War erupted, a continental inferno that the masters of the Ottoman state, the Committee of Union and Progress, chose to enter on the side of the Central Powers. From his seclusion, Vahideddin could only watch in dismay as the empire, already weakened by decades of war and turmoil, was yoked to the German war machine. Then, in 1916, fate intervened with brutal suddenness. The heir to the throne, Crown Prince Yusuf İzzettin, was found dead. The official cause was suicide, but the whispers in the palace corridors spoke of murder, a convenient death for those who found the prince's anti-war stance troublesome. In that moment, everything changed. The forgotten prince, Mehmed Vahideddin, was now Crown Prince Vahideddin, the heir apparent. To be Sultan is to be the shadow of God on earth. But for Mehmed VI, his authority was eclipsed by a far more terrestrial and sinister shadow, the triumvirate known as the Three Pashas. These were the true masters of the Ottoman Empire. There was Enver Pasha, the vainglorious minister of war, whose disastrous ambitions had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. There was Talat Pasha, the iron-fisted Grand Vizier, the chief architect of the Armenian genocide. And there was Jamal Pasha, the ruthless governor of Syria. They were the core of the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turk movement that had seized the state and held it in a death grip. For Mehmed VI, A devout and traditional man who believed in the sacred authority of the caliphate, these men were anathema. He saw them as godless usurpers, political gangsters who had gambled away an empire for their own power and glory. Upon ascending the throne, he was the sovereign in name only. The pashas controlled the army, the police, the bureaucracy, and the press. They presented him with decrees to sign and expected his silent compliance. Mehmed VI was a prisoner in Yıldız Palace, his every move watched, his every visitor noted. He was forced to play a dangerous double game. Publicly, he was the stoic padishah, presiding over state ceremonies. Privately, he seethed, holding clandestine meetings with opposition figures, trying to find cracks in the triumvirate's monolithic power. He knew their war was lost. He knew their continued rule meant the total annihilation of his dynasty and his people. Every day was a tightrope walk over an abyss. He was the legitimate ruler, yet he was powerless. He was the Caliph of all Muslims, yet he could not protect his subjects from his own government. The three pashas were the state, and Mehmed VI was their most prestigious captive, a symbol they needed to legitimize a regime of catastrophe. By the autumn of 1918, the Ottoman war effort had utterly disintegrated. The Bulgarian front collapsed, leaving the road to Constantinople wide open. In Palestine, British forces shattered the remaining Ottoman armies. The game was over. For the three pashas, the time for patriotic posturing had passed. The time for escape had come. In the dead of night, Enver, Talaat, and Jamal boarded a German submarine and fled into exile, abandoning the empire they had bled dry to face the consequences. Their flight was Mehmed VI's liberation. For the first time in his brief, tormented reign, the Sultan was free from their suffocating control, but he was free only to surrender. He immediately dissolved the CUP-led government and appointed his own loyal Grand Vizier, Ahmed İzzet Pasha, with one grim mandate: to secure an armistice with the victorious allies at any cost. The goal was no longer victory or even a negotiated peace. It was survival. The survival of the city, the survival of the Turkish people, and the survival of the House of Osman. The negotiations were a humiliation from the start. The Ottoman delegation was not even permitted to travel to a neutral location. They were summoned to the British battleship HMS Agamemnon, anchored in the Aegean port of Mudros. The terms dictated were absolute. The Ottoman army was to be demobilized. The Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits were to be opened and occupied. Most ominously, Article 7 gave the Allies the right to occupy any part of the former empire if they felt their security was threatened. It was a blank check for total dismemberment. On October 30, 1918, the Armistice of Mudros was signed. For Sultan Mehmed VI, it was a bitter but necessary poison, a deal made to prevent the Allied fleet from sailing into the Golden Horn and occupying his capital by force. But for a generation of Ottoman soldiers and officers, men like Mustafa Kemal, who were still fighting in the field, it was the ultimate betrayal, a capitulation of honor that would ignite the flames of a new national resistance. The Armistice of Mudros was not a negotiation, it was a surrender. And the price of that surrender arrived on the 13th of November, 1918. A fleet of 55 warships, British, French, Italian, even Greek, sailed in a single gray column of steel and smoke, past the silent domes of Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque. They dropped anchor in the Golden Horn, their cannons aimed squarely at the heart of the city, at the windows of the Sultan's palaces. From the marble terraces of Dolmabahce, Sultan Mehmed VI, the 36th sovereign of the House of Osman, watched the final humiliation unfold. He was no longer a caliph, a ruler of the faithful, a padishah of a vast empire. He was a warden in a gilded cage, the custodian of a city that was no longer his own. Constantinople, the city conquered by his ancestor Mehmed II in a blaze of glory, was now a prize for the victors. The streets of Pera, once a vibrant artery of Levantine culture, now echoed with the boots of Allied patrols. British Tommies directed traffic, French Zouaves guarded embassies, and Italian carabinieri stood on street corners, symbols of an authority that had supplanted 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. The Ottoman government, the Sublime Porte, was a ghost, its ministries shadowed by Allied high commissioners who dictated policy, seized assets, and arrested officials at will. For the ordinary Turk, it was a waking nightmare. The pride of a people, already battered by years of war and loss, was now ground into the dust of their own capital. Mehmed VI, a man of quiet disposition and traditional piety, believed the only path to salvation for his dynasty and his people was through cooperation. He saw the Allied presence as a bitter but necessary medicine. To resist, he thought, would be to invite the complete annihilation of what little remained. This fateful calculation, born of fear and pragmatism, would set him on a collision course with the forces of defiance brewing just beyond the city's occupied walls. While Sultan Mehmed VI counseled submission in Constantinople, one of his generals seethed with a cold, calculated fury. Mustafa Kemal Pasha was not a man accustomed to defeat. A hero of the Gallipoli campaign, where he had famously told his men, "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die." He now walked the occupied streets of his capital as a specter of a bygone strength. He saw the Sultan's government as weak, paralyzed, and fatally compromised. He met with ministers, with princes, with fellow officers, searching for a spark of resistance, but found only despair and resignation. He realized that the heart of the empire was no longer beating. The fight for survival would have to begin elsewhere. His opportunity came disguised as an official duty. The British, concerned about unrest and scattered Ottoman army units in the Anatolian interior, pressed the Sultan's government to restore order. Kemal, known for his military prowess, was appointed Inspector General of the Ninth Army, with broad powers to oversee the demobilization process in the Black Sea region. For the Sultan and his allied masters, it was a move to pacify the hinterlands. For Kemal, it was the key to unlocking the cage. On the 16th of May, 1919, he boarded a rickety old steamer, the SS Bandurma, and departed from the shores of the Bosphorus. His departure was not marked by fanfare or ceremony. It was a quiet, almost clandestine slip into the darkness. As the lights of Constantinople faded behind him, he was leaving more than just a city. He was leaving behind the entire imperial structure, the logic of the Sultanate, and the very idea of surrender. He was sailing not just to the port of Samsun, but towards the destiny of a new nation waiting to be born from the ashes of the old. The rebellion had begun, not with a gunshot, but with the quiet churn of a ship's engine, carrying the will of one man into the heartland of Anatolia. The news from Anatolia began to trickle back to Constantinople like a gathering storm. The Sultan's Inspector General was not demobilizing armies, he was building one. He was not quelling dissent, he was organizing it. From Amasya, Erzurum, and Sivas, declarations of national will and resistance were issued, each one a direct challenge to the authority of the occupied capital. Mustafa Kemal was no longer acting as the Sultan's servant. He was acting as the voice of the Turkish nation. For Mehmed VI, trapped between Allied pressure and his own sense of divine right, this was an act of unforgivable treason. The man he had sent to enforce the armistice was now its greatest opponent. The Sublime Porte, urged on by the British, issued a formal recall order. Telegrams crackled across the wires, demanding Kemal's immediate return. The response was a definitive act of rebellion. In a message to the Sultan, Kemal announced his resignation from the Ottoman army, shedding the uniform and title of Pasha to become a civilian, a son of the nation. The Sultan's government retaliated with force. They stripped him of his honors, issued a warrant for his arrest, and, in a move of ultimate condemnation, procured a fatwa from the Sheikh-ul-Islam. This religious decree declared Kemal and his followers as rebels against the Caliph, infidels worthy of death. The empire was now at war with itself. In Constantinople, the Sultan represented the old order, the continuity of the dynasty, and the hope of survival through submission. In the dusty town of Ankara, chosen for its strategic location deep in the Anatolian heartland, Kemal established a rival government, the Grand National Assembly. It was a clash of two worlds, two legitimacies, the divine sovereignty of the Sultan versus the national sovereignty of the people. It was a deeply personal and psychological battle for the soul of a nation, a tragic duel between the last monarch of a 600-year-old empire and the man who would soon become the father of a new republic. As the civil war between the Sultan and the nationalists escalated, the Allied powers in Paris prepared to deliver the final blow. On August 10, 1920, the terms of the peace were unveiled. The document was called the Treaty of Sèvres, and it was not a treaty of peace but a blueprint for the complete dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. Its terms were more punishing, more humiliating than anything the Turkish people could have imagined. The text read like a death warrant. Thrace and the jewel of the Aegean coast, Smyrna, were to be handed to Greece. The Straits, the Bosphorus, and Dardanelles were to become an international zone, stripping the Turks of control over their own capital's waterway. In the east, the treaty promised the creation of an independent Armenia and an autonomous Kurdistan. France and Italy were granted vast spheres of influence across the south. What remained of the once mighty empire was a small, landlocked rump state in northern Anatolia. Its finances, its military, and its police forces all placed under the suffocating control of the Allies. The Sultan's government in Constantinople, with Allied gunboats still floating in the harbor, was given an ultimatum: sign or face even harsher consequences, possibly the complete eradication of Turkish presence in Europe. Under this immense duress, 3 Ottoman delegates put their signatures to the document. In Ankara, the news was received not with despair, but with incandescent rage. The Grand National Assembly denounced the signatories as traitors. For the nationalists, the Sultan's signature on the treaty was the ultimate act of betrayal, proof that the monarchy was no longer the protector of the nation, but an accomplice to its destruction. The Treaty of Sèvres, intended to finalize the empire's defeat, instead became the nationalists' greatest recruiting tool. It erased any middle ground, legitimized Mustafa Kemal's rebellion completely, and transformed a struggle for power into a total war for national existence. The ink on the treaty was not yet dry, but it had already sealed the fate of the Sultanate. In the gilded halls of Istanbul, a desperate calculus of survival was taking shape. Sultan Mehmed VI, a man caught between the crushing weight of his ancestors and the terrifying ambition of his occupiers, saw Anatolia slipping from his grasp. Mustafa Kemal was no longer just a rebellious general. He was the center of a new gravity, pulling the heart of the Turkish nation towards Ankara. The Allied High Commissioners, ever present, whispered poison and promise into the Sultan's ear. They needed a native force to extinguish this nationalist fire, a Turkish hand to strike down a Turkish hero. And so, the ultimate tragic gamble was conceived, the Kuvayi Inzibatiye, the forces of order, better known to history as the Caliphate Army. This was not merely a political move, it was a spiritual one. The Sheikhul Islam, the highest religious authority in the empire, was compelled to issue a fatwa, a sacred decree. It declared Mustafa Kemal and his followers as rebels against the Caliph, the shadow of God on earth. Their struggle was condemned as a sin, their lives forfeit. It was a declaration of civil war, wrapped in the green flag of the Prophet. The plan was as simple as it was brutal: to use the deep-seated loyalty to the Caliphate to turn Turk against Turk. Villages were torn apart, families were divided. For a brief, bloody moment, it seemed to work. The Caliphate army, backed by Allied funds and British arms, made initial gains. But they were fighting against an idea whose time had come. The nationalists were fighting for a homeland, for dignity, for a future. The Sultan's men were fighting for a crumbling past, for a monarch who was seen as a puppet. The Caliphate army dissolved like mist in the Anatolian sun, its soldiers defecting, its purpose lost. For Mehmed VI, it was a catastrophic failure. He had not only failed to crush the rebellion, he had legitimized it by forcing the people to choose, and they had not chosen him. While the Sultan's authority bled out in the corridors of his palace, a storm was gathering in the heart of Anatolia. The nationalist movement, having survived civil war and consolidated its power, now turned its gaze west, to the Greek armies occupying the fertile lands of the Aegean. For 2 years the front had been a bloody stalemate, but Mustafa Kemal was not a man of stalemates. He was a man of lightning, of decisive, overwhelming force. In the sweltering heat of August 1922, he unleashed it. The operation was codenamed Büyük Taarruz, the Great Offensive. It was the culmination of months of secret preparations, of munitions smuggled past Allied patrols, of peasants trained into a disciplined fighting force. On the morning of August 26th, a deafening artillery barrage shattered the dawn over the hills of Afyonkarahisar. The Greek lines, believed to be impregnable, were torn asunder. This was not a battle. It was an annihilation. The decisive moment came at Dumlupinar, where the bulk of the Greek army was encircled and systematically destroyed. The Greek commander, General Trikoupis, was captured, not even realizing he had been appointed commander-in-chief until he was informed by his Turkish captors. The news of the victory swept across Anatolia like a wildfire of hope. In Istanbul, it landed like a death sentence. Every cannon shot fired in the west was another nail in the coffin of the Ottoman dynasty. The Sultan, a virtual prisoner in his own capital, could only listen to the reports with a growing sense of dread. The power was no longer his. It was no longer in Istanbul. It was being forged in the crucible of war by the one man he had tried and failed to destroy. A new Turkey was rising, and it had no need for a sultan. The culmination of the great offensive was the city of Smyrna. Known as the Pearl of the Orient, it was the jewel of the Aegean, a vibrant cosmopolitan metropolis where Turkish, Greek, Armenian, and Levantine communities coexisted in a delicate, prosperous balance. But in September 1922, it became the funeral pyre of the old Ottoman world. On September 9th, Mustafa Kemal's victorious cavalry rode into the city. The Greek administration had collapsed, its army in full chaotic retreat. For a few days, an eerie tension held the city in its grip. Then, on September 13th, the fire started. It began in the Armenian quarter and, fanned by a strong wind, grew into an unstoppable inferno. The flames devoured the wooden houses and narrow streets, consuming the Greek and European sections of the city with terrifying speed. The sky turned black with smoke, visible for miles out at sea. The city's inhabitants, caught in a trap of fire and violence, fled to the waterfront. There, a scene from Dante's Inferno unfolded. A massive, terrified crowd was pinned between a wall of fire and the indifferent sea, where Allied warships lay at anchor, under strict orders not to intervene. The screams of the dying, the roar of the blaze, the crackle of collapsing buildings. It was the sound of a world ending. The Great Fire of Smyrna remains one of the most disputed and tragic events of the 20th century. Who started it is a question mired in claim and counterclaim. But for the aging sultan in Istanbul, the answer was irrelevant. The news would have reached him as the ultimate horror. The most prosperous city of his empire had been turned to ash. It was a brutal, physical manifestation of his own failure. The multicultural dream of the Ottomans had died in the flames, and from its ashes, a new, fiercely homogeneous nation was being born. The smoke from Smyrna had barely cleared when the final political blows began to fall. The armistice of Mudanya was signed, ending the war. The Sultan's government was not even invited to the negotiations. The world now dealt with Ankara, not Istanbul. For Mehmed VI, the walls of his palace, be it Yıldız or Dolmabahce, were no longer a symbol of power, but the gilded bars of a cage. The vast, silent halls that once echoed with the pronouncements of emperors now amplified only whispers and the sound of his own fearful heartbeat. Every servant, every guard, every official was a potential spy. Loyalty was a currency that had lost all its value. The Sultan was politically dead, a ghost haunting his own throne while a new government in Ankara debated his fate. The whispers grew louder, more terrifying. They spoke of trials, of treason. They spoke of the Grand National Assembly's intention to do the unthinkable, to abolish the Sultanate itself, to sever a 600-year-old line of succession that stretched back to Osman Gazi. This was not just the end of his reign. It was the end of his world, the eradication of the very reason for his existence. Mehmed VI, the 36th Sultan of the House of Osman, Caliph of all Muslims, now feared for his life. He was isolated, powerless, and saw enemies in every shadow. His great-grandfather, Mahmud II, had massacred the Janissaries to save the throne. His brother, Abdul Hamid II, had ruled through a web of spies to preserve his power. Mehmed possessed neither the ruthlessness nor the cunning of his ancestors. His only remaining move was not one of power, but of survival. His gaze turned to the British warships in the Bosphorus, the very symbols of his humiliation. They were now his only hope of escape. The end did not come with a bang, but with the scratch of a pen. Far from the gilded cages of Istanbul, in the dusty, pragmatic heart of Anatolia, a new power had solidified. In Ankara, Mustafa Kemal's Grand National Assembly was no longer a provisional government of rebels. It was the uncontested voice of the Turkish nation, and its verdict was absolute. On November 1, 1922, the air in the Assembly Hall crackled with the revolutionary fervor that had been building for years. The motion was put forward not as a debate, but as a declaration of fact. The Ottoman Sultanate, an institution that had shaped the world for over 600 years, was abolished. It was a political masterstroke, a surgical removal of the empire's head. The arguments were both legal and historical. The Sultan, they declared, had forfeited his right to rule by collaborating with the occupying Allied powers by signing the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres. He was a puppet, a relic. The true sovereignty, the millet, the will of the people, now resided solely with the Assembly. The Sultanate and the Caliphate were to be separated. The Caliphate, a religious title, would remain for a time within the House of Osman, but the temporal, political power of the Sultan was extinguished forever. When the news reached Istanbul, it swept through the city like a chilling wind off the Bosphorus. For Mehmed VI, sitting in Yıldız Palace, it was the final formal confirmation of his powerlessness. He was no longer Sultan Mehmed VI, ruler of the Ottoman Empire. He was simply Vahdettin, a private citizen trapped in a palace, a sovereign with no subjects, a king with no kingdom. The edict from Ankara had rendered him a ghost in his own home, the last echo of a dynasty that had once made the world tremble. 10 days after the abolition, on Friday, November 10th, Mehmed Vahideddin decided to perform a final defiant act of sovereignty. He would attend the public Friday prayer, the Selamlik. For centuries, this weekly procession was the ultimate theater of imperial power, a dazzling display where the Sultan, as both ruler and caliph, presented himself to his people and to God. But this was to be no ordinary Selamlik. It was a ghost of the past, a funeral procession for an empire. As Vahdettin emerged from Yıldız Palace, the familiar pomp was gone. The grand imperial carriage was replaced by a simple automobile. The usual throngs of adoring subjects were thin, their faces a mixture of pity, fear, and contempt. The thunderous cries of "Long live our Padishah" were replaced by a nervous, unsettling silence. Along the route, the eyes of the city were upon him, but they were not the eyes of loyal subjects. They were the cold, assessing stares of British occupation troops and the watchful, dangerous glances of Kemalist agents who now controlled the city's police and saw this act as a provocation. He was a caliph without a state, a monarch without authority, moving through his own capital as a marked man. Inside the mosque, the air was thick with unspoken words. Every boo, every prayer was freighted with the weight of 600 years of history coming to a close. This was more than a religious ritual. It was a public farewell. Vahideddin, a man known for his quiet piety, was performing his role for the last time on the world stage. As he left the mosque, returning to his palace prison, he knew the truth in his bones. This was the end. The title of Caliph offered no protection. In the eyes of Ankara, he was a traitor. And in a revolution, traitors do not retire peacefully. The days following the final salamlik were a torment of silence and fear. Within the walls of Yıldız Palace, Mehmed Vahideddin was isolated, a prisoner of his own legacy. The nationalist press in Istanbul, now unleashed, bayed for his blood, branding him a traitor and an enemy of the people. Rumors swirled of a public trial, of an ignominious fate similar to that of Russia's Tsar Nicholas II. The Sultan knew that the protection of the Allied forces was his only shield, and a fragile one at that. The British, French, and Italians were pragmatic. They would not risk a war with Kemal to save a deposed monarch. His life, he concluded, was in imminent danger. The decision was agonizing. To flee was to confirm the accusations of cowardice and treachery. To stay was to risk martyrdom at the hands of his enemies. In the end, the instinct for survival won. In the deep quiet of the night, on November 16th, Vahideddin sat down to compose the most humiliating letter of his life. It was addressed to the commander of the British occupation forces, General Sir Charles Harrington. The letter was a masterpiece of desperate diplomacy. He did not write as a sultan demanding aid, but as the Caliph of all Moslems, appealing for refuge. "Sir," it began, "in view of the dangerous situation in which I find myself in Istanbul, I take refuge with the British government and request my transfer as soon as possible from Istanbul to another place." He signed it not as Sultan, but with the spiritual authority he believed he still possessed. Mehmed Vahideddin, Caliph of the Muslims. It was a profound capitulation. The leader of the Sunni Islamic world, the successor to the conquerors of Constantinople, was formally placing his life and safety into the hands of a Christian general. The letter was secretly delivered, a quiet surrender that sealed the fate of the Ottoman throne forever. The British response was swift and secret. General Harrington, a soldier, not a politician, saw a man whose life was in danger and agreed to help. The plan was set for the following morning. Before the first call to prayer echoed across the hills of Istanbul on November 17, 1922, the ancient palace of Yıldız was shrouded in a cold, pre-dawn mist. Inside, a small somber group gathered in the shadows. There was no grand entourage, no ministers, no pashas. There was only Mehmed Vahideddin, his 10-year-old son, Prince Ertuğrul, the first chamberlain, his doctor, a secretary, and a handful of musicians from the royal band, men of unwavering personal loyalty. They carried with them only a few small suitcases. Vahideddin took one last look at the gilded rooms that had been both his birthright and his prison. He was abandoning everything: his throne, his country, his history. Guided by a British officer, the small party slipped not through the grand imperial gate, but through a small discreet side entrance in the palace gardens. 2 red-crossed British military ambulances were waiting, their engines idling softly in the damp air. The choice of vehicle was a deliberate deception. To any curious observer, it was merely a routine medical transport. They climbed in, the doors closed, and the vehicles pulled away, disappearing into the still dark streets of the capital. The journey through the sleeping city was tense and silent. They were driving away from 6 centuries of their family's rule. At the Topane Quay, they were met by a launch from the HMS Malaya, a British super-dreadnought battleship whose gray, menacing silhouette dominated the Bosphorus. As the small boat cut through the cold water towards the warship, the first light of dawn began to break, illuminating the iconic skyline of minarets and domes. It was the dawn of a new day for Turkey, but for Mehmed Vahideddin, it was the final, irrevocable sunset of the Ottoman Empire. The air on the deck of the HMS Malaya was cold, thick with the alien smells of coal smoke and salt spray, a stark contrast to the familiar scent of jasmine and cypress from the palace gardens. At dawn on November 17, 1922, Mehmed VI, the 36th Sultan of the House of Osman and the 100th Caliph of Islam, stepped from a small motorboat onto the steel gangway of the British warship. He was no longer a sovereign stepping onto his imperial barge. He was a fugitive seeking asylum. Gone were the ceremonial caftans and jeweled turbans. He wore a simple European suit, the dark fabric a funereal testament to the death of his world. His small retinue, including his young son, huddled close, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and disbelief. As the warship's powerful engines rumbled to life, the last sultan watched the city he was abandoning recede into the morning mist. The iconic skyline of Istanbul, the 6 minarets of the Blue Mosque, the sprawling domes of the Hagia Sophia, the ancient silhouette of the Topkapi Palace where his ancestors had ruled for 4 centuries, dissolved like a dream. Every wave that slapped against the hull of the Malaya was a physical blow, severing the sacred 600-year-old bond between his dynasty and its capital. On board, the British sailors watched with a detached curiosity. To them, he was a historical curiosity, a fallen monarch, the sick man of Europe, finally succumbing to his long illness. But for Mehmed, this was not a political maneuver or a strategic retreat. It was the end of everything. He was a prisoner of his protectors, a ghost sailing away from his own history, leaving behind not just a throne, but the very meaning of his existence. The waters of the Bosphorus, which had witnessed the triumphs and tragedies of his ancestors, now carried him into the black unknown of exile. As the HMS Malaya steamed towards the British fortress of Malta, the Sultanate of Mehmed VI dissolved in its wake. The Grand National Assembly in Ankara, led by Mustafa Kemal, had already abolished the office, rendering his temporal power null and void. But another, more ancient title remained, Caliph of Islam. This was not a crown that could be so easily discarded by a secular assembly. It was a spiritual mantle, a claim to leadership over the world's Sunni Muslims, an authority that transcended borders and armies. Aboard the warship, surrounded by foreign soldiers and the endless sea, Mehmed was forced to confront the schism within himself. He was a king with no country, but a caliph with a global flock. The paradox was agonizing. How could he guide the faithful when he himself was adrift, a guest of a Christian empire? The news of his flight aboard a British vessel sent shockwaves across the Muslim world. In India, in Egypt, in the Levant, the faithful were stunned. The protector of the holy cities, the successor to the Prophet's companions, had sought refuge with the very powers that had dismembered his empire. For some, it was an unforgivable betrayal. For others, a source of profound pity and confusion. The British, for their part, handled their high-value refugee with careful ambiguity. He was afforded the courtesies of a former head of state, but he was also a pawn, his continued claim to the caliphate a useful tool to be wielded against the rising nationalist tide in Turkey. While Mehmed sat in quiet contemplation, staring at the gray horizon, his departure created a vacuum that set in motion the final act. In Ankara, the assembly would soon make its move, not just against the man, but against the institution itself, preparing to sever the final link to the Ottoman past and reshape the future of Islam forever. From Malta, the journey of exile led Mehmed to the Italian Riviera, to the sun-drenched town of San Remo. The glamour of the locale was a cruel mockery of his reality. the man who had once presided over the immense wealth of the Ottoman treasury, whose every whim was financed by the taxes of a vast empire, was now effectively destitute. The new Turkish Republic had seized all imperial assets, declaring the dynasty's property to be that of the state. Mehmed arrived in Europe with little more than some personal jewelry and the clothes on his back. His life in a rented villa became a humiliating battle for financial survival. The title of Sultan carried no currency with local merchants. He was forced to sell his wife's jewels piece by piece to pay for daily expenses. Creditors, who had initially been impressed by his royal pedigree, soon grew impatient. Letters were sent, not to a Grand Vizier, but to the few remaining loyalists and sympathetic Muslim leaders, like the Nizam of Hyderabad, pleading for funds. Each request was a fresh wound to his pride. This was the slow, grinding erosion of majesty. Power, he was learning, was not merely an abstract concept of lineage and divine right. It was liquid. It was the ability to pay for a meal, to settle a bill, to command loyalty through patronage. Without the state's coffers, his influence evaporated. His attempts to form a government in exile or rally support for a restoration were hollow gestures, political theater without an audience or a budget. He was a monarch reduced to the status of a common debtor, haunted by the ghost of an empire he could no longer afford. Every sunset over the Ligurian Sea was a reminder of the splendor he had lost, and every morning brought the renewed, pressing anxiety of a man who could no longer pay his way in the world. On May 16, 1926, in his rented villa in San Remo, Mehmed Vahideddin, the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire, died. His final years had been a slow descent into obscurity, his health broken by the immense weight of his fall from power. But the final, most profound indignity was yet to come. Upon his death, his Italian creditors, fearing they would never be paid, took an unprecedented step. They obtained a legal order and seized his body. The coffin of the last Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, was locked in the cellar of his villa, held hostage by bailiffs for a debt of a few thousand lira. It was a macabre and tragic postscript to a 600-year-old saga. The man whose ancestors had conquered Constantinople and laid siege to Vienna could not even begin his final journey to the grave. His daughter, Sabiha Sultan, was frantic. She launched a desperate campaign, sending telegrams to the remaining pockets of Ottoman loyalists and foreign heads of state. The news of the Caliph's coffin being held for ransom was a scandal that shamed the Muslim world. Finally, donations, primarily from the Nizam of Hyderabad and the King of Hijaz, were secured. The debts were paid, and the coffin was released. But where was he to be buried? The Turkish Republic, the nation he had once ruled, refused his body entry. He was anathema to the new secular state. There was no place for him, not even in death. And so his final journey was not a triumphant return to the imperial tombs in Istanbul, but a sorrowful voyage to another former corner of his shattered empire. He was taken to Damascus, in French-mandated Syria, and laid to rest in the cemetery of the Tekiye Mosque, a complex built by his most magnificent ancestor, Suleiman the Magnificent. The final Ottoman Sultan was buried in foreign soil, his end a quiet, mournful testament to the absolute finality of his empire's collapse.